So what I want you to imagine is an arrow. And an arrow, of course, has an arrowhead, and it has the shaft of that arrow. And in the context of the neuroscience of focus and concentration, the neurochemical system that really represents the shaft of that arrow, right, the straight line, is epinephrine, also called adrenaline. And today I'll refer to adrenaline and epinephrine interchangeably. It turns out that epinephrine/adrenaline are released within your brain from a little location, a little cluster of neurons called locus coeruleus, but you do not need to remember that name, and from your body from the adrenal glands. And the release of epinephrine from those two locations overall increases energy. It increases alertness. It does not alone increase focus. Okay, so the reason I've assigned epinephrine, adrenaline, as the shaft of the arrow is that if focus is the arrow, there is no focus without epinephrine. So things, whether or not they're behavioral or psychological or supplements or drugs that increase epinephrine, allow focus to occur. They are necessary for focus, but they are not sufficient for focus. That is, they are required, but they are not enough to create focus. So we're going to need epinephrine in the equation. Without epinephrine, there is no focus or concentration. Now, the arrowhead on this metaphorical arrowhead that represents focus and concentration is going to be represented or related to the mechanisms of acetylcholine, a different neurochemical that also exists in the brain and body. In fact, in the body, it's responsible for the contraction and movement of your muscles. But today we're talking about acetylcholine, not in that context, but rather in the context of its release within the brain. Acetylcholine is released from a couple of different locations in the brain, and the best way to think about it is it's like a spotlight. It highlights specific neurons, nerve cells that should be active, or more active, I should say, than the other neurons in the environment. So the reason I've assigned the arrowhead to acetylcholine and acetylcholine to the arrowhead is that if you have an arrow with a very big arrowhead that's really broad, really blunt, imagine a mile-wide arrowhead, that's not very focused on any one location. It's not really pointing to any one location, is it? But with a narrow, really tightly focused arrowhead, well, that's focused on one location. So we have alertness, epinephrine, and then we have the actual direction in which our concentration and focus is placed, and that's, at least in this mental model I'm creating, acetylcholine. And then in order to have ongoing focus, we need another neurochemical. And it turns out that that third neurochemical is dopamine, a molecule often associated with pleasure and reward, but it's really the molecule of motivation. So here I want you to imagine in your mind an arrow with an arrowhead, think acetylcholine in the arrowhead, a shaft or a line behind that arrowhead, which is epinephrine, also called adrenaline, and then behind it, a sort of an engine that keeps that focus moving forward, right? Because we don't just want to be focused for a moment, we want to be able to focus for 10 minutes or for an hour, or maybe even for 2 hours. Turns out there's an optimal duration to focus. I'll teach you that in just a little bit. But these three neurochemicals together, acetylcholine, epinephrine, and dopamine, really allow you to get focused, to focus very precisely, and in fact, increasingly precisely over time, to really narrow and narrow and narrow your focus progressively within a single bout of focus, and to continue to do that and to be able to do that repeatedly whenever you want. If you want to think about tools of any kind to modify your biology or physiology in any way, whether or not it's for cognitive function, or you want to get better at exercising, or you want to build muscle, or you want to improve your hormones, you need to think and understand tools in the context of modulation and mediation. What do I mean by that? Well, it's quite simple, really. Mediation is how specific types of chemicals and cells and circuits and organs control very specific things in your brain and body. Whereas modulation is the ability of chemicals and cells and circuits to adjust how different things change, how different things work in your brain and body, but to do it more broadly. What do I mean by this? Let me give an example. For instance, I'm going to tell you now that one of the most important things to build and maintain your focus and concentration is to optimize your sleeping behavior. That is to get enough quality sleep, I would say 80% of the nights of your life. Sleep has been shown to relate to cognitive performance, physical performance, hormone output, and so many other things, including immune system function. What we can reliably say is that sleep modulates just about every process in your brain and body. So you have to get great sleep. There's simply no tool that's going to allow you to overcome chronic sleep deprivation and allow you to remain focused. No pill, no device, no supplement, no protocol whatsoever. Why do I say sleep modulates focus and attention? Well, I'll give an analogy. If right now someone pulled a fire alarm in this building, or if we had a fire in this building, my attention would drift. It would not be on recording this podcast, it would be on something else. But would I say that the fire alarm mediates attention? I mean, fire alarms are not really involved in attention. No, rather, they modulate my attention. The noise in the room modulates my attention. That's quite a bit different than a tool that I'll provide later, and I'll just give you a little hint of now. In fact, I'll give it to you now, which is that 40 hertz binaural beats have been shown in a number of peer-reviewed studies to increase focus and concentration. And if you'd like to access 40 hertz binaural beats in order to improve your focus and concentration, it's been shown in multiple quality peer-reviewed studies that playing a pattern of sound waves to one ear, do, 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 and the other ear, which is slightly offset in frequency, meaning not quite the same frequency, so more like do, 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 that combination of frequencies played to the different ears actually get integrated within deep brain centers and can increase focus and concentration in part by increasing levels of the neurochemical dopamine and acetylcholine. Okay, so assuming that you are sleeping well 80% of the nights of your life, or at least working on the various protocols and tools to sleep well and sufficiently long 80% of the nights of your life, and you are interested in additional tools that are sound-based in order to improve your ability to concentrate and focus, there are quality peer-reviewed studies supporting the idea that white noise or pink noise, and believe it or not, there is something called pink noise. It has to do with the specific frequencies of sound that are in the noise. Well, white noise and pink noise have been shown to not improve concentration per se, but to improve people's ability to transition into concentrated states. So I don't tend to use white noise and pink noise while I work, but I know a number of people that do. I know people that also use what's called brown noise, listen to it through headphones or in the room. There is indeed some data to support the fact that white noise and to some extent pink noise and brown noise can support the release of particular neurochemicals, but more data showing that they can amplify the activity of neurons in the so-called prefrontal cortex, this front area, the sort of the bumper behind your forehead, that is directly related to your ability to direct your own focus and remain focused on certain things. So you have the option of either using binaural beats before but not during your work, that is 40 hertz binaural beats, or 40 hertz binaural beats throughout your attempt to focus. You also have the option of not using binaural beats, but using white noise, pink noise, or brown noise. Again, this is a really key point. A lot of people are challenged with getting into a mode of focus. None of us, however, should be expected to just sit down and drop directly into a state of focus. I think that's completely an unfair. Focus is dynamic. It is not what we call a step function. It's not like you go from unfocused to focused and then you drop into your maximal focus. Be patient with yourself and also understand that focus is an ability, that you can improve your ability to focus by engaging the neural circuits responsible for focus repeatedly over time through so-called neuroplasticity, the ability of your nervous system to change in response to experience. And that has a couple of different components, but put very simply, what we repeat gets etched into our nervous system and becomes easier over time. And the more emotionally important or vital something feels to us, the more likely it is to trigger neuroplasticity. How long should I try to focus? Well, the research literature point to the key importance of so-called ultradian cycles. You've all probably heard of circadian cycles or circadian biology. Circa, the day, circadian, is about 24-hour cycle. Well, our brain and body operate within that day, or within each and every day, I should say, with 90-minute ultradian cycles. So my suggestion would be anytime you're going to sit down and try and focus, you're going to try and do a focused bout of physical exercise or skill learning or musical learning, or maybe you're even just having a conversation. Maybe you're a therapist or you're attending therapy or a class. How long should it be? And the ideal duration is about 90 minutes. Not exactly 90 minutes, but we can reliably say 90 minutes or less. Okay, it doesn't have to be the full 90 minutes, but trying to push yourself to be able to drop into 2 hours of focus or 3 hours of focus while possible is not really in line with what we know about the underlying biology. Everything from our sleep states or the different stages of sleep and our waking states is divided into these 90-minute cycles, or so-called ultradian cycles. Your brain is the chief consumer of metabolic energy. The calories that you consume is so-called basal metabolic rate. Most of that isn't related to movement or heartbeat or breathing. It's related to brain function. Your brain is a glutton with respect to caloric need. So understand that at the end of 90 minutes, or maybe even after 45 minutes, you might feel rather tired or even exhausted. And it's very important that after a bout of focus, that you take at least 10 minutes, and ideally as long as 30 minutes, and go through what I call deliberate defocus. You really want to focus on somewhat menial tasks or things that really don't require a ton of your concentration. This is starting to become a little bit of a movement out there in the kind of pop psychology and optimization world, this idea of not looking at your phone as you walk down the hall to the bathroom, certainly not looking at your phone in the bathroom. And I should mention, by the way, this is a particular annoyance of mine. Have you noticed? And give yourself some time to deliberately decompress, to let your mental states idle, to not be focused on any one thing. That period of idling is essential for your ability to focus, much in the same way that rest between sets of resistance training or rest between exercise is vital to being able to focus and perform during the actual sets or during the actual bouts of running or cycling or whatever your particular form of exercise might be. So deliberate decompression is key. I know certain people are ketogenic, and I can say that for people who achieve ketosis and can get into ketosis, yes, indeed, there is a mental state associated with ketosis that will allow your brain to function and to think really clearly that many people find very attractive and keep them going back over and over again to a ketogenic diet. I'm somebody who, for instance, has not been in ketosis many times in my life, at least not deliberately so. But I actually will ingest liquid ketones from time to time because of the further cognitive enhancement or physical enhancement that I experience on top of nutrition that does include some carbohydrates. So there are a lot of different ways to approach all this. Whether or not you're a vegan, omnivore, vegetarian, carnivore, etc., the point is this. Your ability to focus, and in fact, your ability of neurons to encode specific information in your environment, that is, to represent what's out there in the world, is actually related to your blood glucose level. Now, here I'm setting aside the discussion of ketosis and ketogenic diets for the moment. But there's a beautiful study that was published in Neuron not long ago that showed that the tuning, that is the precision with which neurons in the brain represent things in our environment, is actually much greater when there is sufficient glucose in the brain. Translated into English, this means that when we are fasted or when our blood glucose is very low, we aren't able to perceive and think about things as clearly. Now, there's a twist to this, however. Many people who practice intermittent fasting, and I should say I practice a sort of pseudo-intermittent fasting. I generally eat my meals between the hours of 11 a.m. and 8 p.m., although sometimes there's some wiggle around that. Occasionally I have an early breakfast. I'm not super rigid about it. But I know there are a number of people who are doing longer fasts, or they're eating in a 6-hour window. We did an entire episode about fasting. You can, again, find that at hubermanlab.com. We'll likely have Sachin Panda, who's an expert in intermittent fasting, on the podcast. Intermittent fasting has a lot of different potential benefits. For some people, it's a convenient way to restrict their calories. For other people, it's a convenient way to avoid eating. That is, it's easier to not eat than to eat a small portion, so they opt for intermittent fasting, and so on and so forth. But one of the things that you hear very often is that some people like being fasted because they like the clarity of mind that it provides. Here's the situation. Neurons, unless you're in a ketogenic diet, really thrive on glucose. They love glucose. And as I mentioned before, your ability to think and perceive things is actually enhanced by having sufficient glucose in your bloodstream. So why would it be that some people experience a heightened state of mental clarity when they are fasted? Because they don't have as much of that parasympathetic activation. They're just not as sleepy. And in fact, under those conditions, half as much caffeine will give you just as much lift as twice as much caffeine will give you on a full belly of pasta. And that's just the way that caffeine interacts with blood glucose. So what I'd like you to imagine is if you had a measure of focus from 0 to 10, these are arbitrary units, 10 being maximally focused and 0 being not focused at all. Imagine a U-shaped function, right? Where if you're very fasted, you're going to have a high degree of focus and concentration. But then if you ingest some food and your belly is full, your focus and concentration is reduced. But having enough blood glucose and maybe even elevated blood glucose will increase cognitive function. So there are two ends of the spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, blood glucose is relatively low and you're fasted and you can think and behave in a very concentrated way. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have a lot of blood glucose, or I should say sufficient blood glucose. You never want your blood glucose to be too high. And that allows your neurons to encode and perceive and basically allow you to think really clearly. So you sort of have to pick your condition. What do you want for your bouts of focus and concentration? I also want to touch back on this idea of which foods can increase focus. In the episode on ADHD that I did, I touched on this quite a bit as it relates to elimination diets. There's a whole industry and a ton of interest for obvious reasons into what sorts of things kids and adults should and shouldn't eat in order to reduce symptoms of ADHD. I think that the sum total of those data point to the fact that reducing simple sugar intake and certainly highly processed foods, so ice cream, candy, chips, etc., those sorts of things really does seem to improve symptoms of ADHD in both children and adults. But once you move past that and you start to say, well, which foods can improve concentration and focus? Well, foods that, for instance, include a lot of tyrosine, which is a precursor to dopamine, and now you know why dopamine is important in this context, are certainly going to increase concentration and focus. So things like Parmesan cheese, certain meats, certain nuts, you can look up which foods contain high amounts of tyrosine. There are also some fruits and vegetables that include higher amounts of tyrosine. I know many people are curious as to whether or not caffeine can improve focus and concentration. And indeed, it can. There is an immense amount of data supporting the idea that caffeine, provided it's consumed in the appropriate dosages, can improve mental performance and physical performance. And it largely does that through improvements in focus and concentration. The dosage of caffeine, of course, is going to depend on how caffeine adapted you are, how much caffeine tolerance you have. And that is going to vary tremendously depending on whether or not you ingest that caffeine with or without food, as I mentioned earlier. But there is a kind of general range in which we can talk about caffeine as being useful for focus and concentration. And the range is basically from 100 milligrams to 400 milligrams. I want to caution everybody out there, if you're somebody who suffers from anxiety or panic attacks and you're not used to ingesting caffeine and you run out and ingest 400 milligrams of caffeine in the form of espresso or yerba mate or an energy drink or in pill form, that is going to be very uncomfortable for you. You're going to be sweating profusely, your heart rate is going to increase, you're going to be quite panicked. Now, there are other ways to increase epinephrine in the brain and body besides caffeine or other stimulants. And in fact, that has been studied. There's an excellent study that was carried out not that long ago on how stress itself can increase our ability to focus and concentrate. That's right, how stress itself can increase focus and concentration. Most people think of stress as impairing our ability to focus, but that's actually not true. When we are stressed, it involves the deployment, the release of adrenaline, epinephrine, and that adrenaline both changes our visual field. In other words, it narrows our vision to a more tunnel-like focus. That is, it makes the arrow in our metaphor of the arrow more sharp, and it improves our concentration. And this makes sense given what we know about stress. When we're stressed, we tend to be stressed about a specific thing. We start anticipating or wondering or thinking about what's going to happen next. What led up to this? How is this going to impact me? How do I feel right now? It really narrows the context of our thinking and our behavior. This may come as surprising because like many people think, gosh, stress really diminishes cognitive performance, but that's absolutely wrong. Stress improves cognitive performance. Now, of course, there are other ways to increase stress levels and to do that in healthy ways to improve concentration and performance. And one of the best ways to do that, because it's so surefire and it's generally safe, provided you do it safely, is deliberate cold exposure. This is something I've talked about on the podcast before, but deliberate cold exposure can be achieved by getting into a cold shower for 1 to 5 minutes. If you're not used to it, you probably want to start with 1 minute, or you can get into an ice bath. And nowadays there are a number of different commercial sources of circulating cold water, or if you have access to a body of cold water like a lake or a pool or an ocean, we know that getting into cold water or under cold water greatly increases epinephrine levels and dopamine levels in the brain and blood. For sake of today's discussion, if you're interested in ways to improve focus and concentration, you need to increase your epinephrine, your adrenaline levels. Cold water exposure is one of the most efficient ways to do that. This is not a biohack. I don't like the word hack. I know it's commonly used, but a hack is something where you're using one thing for a different purpose than it was originally intended for. And here, I'm not referring to the shower or the cold bath, I'm referring to epinephrine. Epinephrine is a neurochemical that will place your vision into more of a tunnel mode, which will allow you to focus on cognitive work or physical work in a more specific way. You're not going to be as distractible. And it's very easy to achieve by getting into a cold shower or a cold body of water for a brief period of time. People always ask how long to get under or into cold water and how cold to make it. Here's the thing, it should be uncomfortably cold but safe to stay in for 1 to 5 minutes. Okay, so uncomfortably cold that you really want to get out, but safe to stay in. Not so cold that it's going to give you a heart attack, and not so warm that it's comfortable that it doesn't create that adrenaline release. Cold water exposure, I should say deliberate cold water or non-deliberate cold water exposure, reliably increases epinephrine levels. It is incredibly useful as a tool for this. And it is in fact zero cost or even negative zero cost. How could it be negative zero cost? Well, you can certainly save on your heating bill by taking a cold shower. So that's one way. And for those